I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us on Zoom. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. Tonight's talk is sponsored by the Keelan Family Foundation. I'd like to, on behalf of the GMALL Board of Directors, express our sincere thanks to Don and Beryl Keelan for their support. So thank you, Don.
You're welcome.
Here, here.
Our presenter this evening is Derek Boothby. Derek has been involved in international political and security matters for over 40 years, both working in the United Nations and elsewhere. In the UN, he worked on arms control and arms limitations and was director of the Europe Division in the Department of Political Affairs. He was the deputy director for operations in UN weapons inspection and destruction in Iraq, led a chemical weapon investigation in Azerbaijan and Armenia, was second in command of a UN military and civilian operation in the Balkans, and later chairman of the UN's Iraq Operational Group. He has given several talks for GMALL, and together with Peter Radford has been a lively contributor to our GMALL debates. Thank you, Derek, for being our guest this evening.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. Before I begin, just a couple of words of a confession. I'm about to inflict upon you over 45 slides, and it may appear to some of you that I'm getting too much into the weeds. In my defense, all I can say is that it is in the weeds that the Chinese dragons are lurking. And if we wish to know them well, then it is into the weeds that we must go. As Peter said in his Zoom talk last week, in just a few short years, China has grown from an introspective backward country to the largest economy in the world by the measure of purchasing power parity. But this is not a talk about how China achieved this progress, nor about China's trade war with the United States, nor about China's military activities and the US-China military confrontation in the China Seas. No, this is a talk about where China is going, or hopes to go from here. China doesn't intend to change the world by military aggression, nor by conversion of the world to communism, but it does intend to achieve superpower status and global influence by international development and economic expansion. And at the end of my talk, I shall offer some thoughts on why Americans in particular, and the West in general, should really take some care. And I shall pose some serious questions about the future, because it is going to be a very different world. Peter spoke of 2049. Michael Pillsbury is the director of the Center for Chinese Strategy at the Hudson Institute. In his 2015 book, The 100-Year Marathon, he maintained that China had a secret strategy to replace the United States as the global superpower by 2049, which will be the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China by Mao Zedong. But this is no longer secret. China has announced that it seeks to achieve, quote, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, unquote, by 2049. It is an open, publicly announced and declared policy. And it is also well known to the professionals in the State Department, the Pentagon, and the intelligence community, but I believe that the American general public is largely unaware of the extent of this huge program. What is happening is that the world economy is being restructured in many ways, and a principal architect and tool of this restructuring is China and its Belt and Road Initiative. Some Westerners have likened it to the Marshall Plan, but I assure you it is far, far larger in scope and ambition. First, let me give some background to how this all came about. During the years that followed the communist revolution that brought Mao Zedong to power in 1949, China remained economically and industrially backward. After Mao died in 1976, in 1978, Deng Xiaoping embarked on a new policy, a policy of convincing the Chinese Communist Party leadership that instead of being introverted and defensive, China must look outwards. And this involved developing friendly relations with capitalism and with the developed world. In Deng Xiaoping's view, no more should China continue to be humiliated by Western and Japanese actors, such as in the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century, the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, the Europeans and America in the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, and the rape of Nanking by Japanese forces in 1937-38. So during the years of change that followed, as Chinese academics and think tanks developed their ideas, the Chinese leadership looked outside, and they frankly didn't like some of what they saw. They looked at Russia, and in Russia, Gorbachev had adopted a policy of first changing the political structure, which he then intended to follow it with major economic development. But the party lost control, and economic development didn't happen. Communism and the Soviet Union were swept away. In the West, free market capitalism and slackening of government regulation and oversight had resulted in a recession of 2008 and 2009. Freewheeling methods of elections and politics in general in the West often produced discord and dysfunction. No, in China, things would be different. China had had a long history of control from the center, and so the Communist Party must remain firmly in control of all aspects of government. And with a population of 1.3 billion and the heavy force that had to be used to put down the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square in 1989, it was clear that change would have to be managed very carefully from the top. So in March 2013, Xi Jinping became General Secretary of the Communist Party, President of the People's Republic, and Chairman of the Military Commission, all three. Early in the course of his rise to power in the party, in 1985, he had been a member of a Chinese delegation to study US agriculture, and he'd stayed for 2 weeks with an American family in Muscatine, Iowa. Now, it's been held that this experience had a lasting impression on him, both favorable and unfavorable, his views of the United States. So in October 2013, Xi Jinping made visits to Kazakhstan and Indonesia, where he unveiled Yi Dai, Yi Lu, One Belt, One Road. In November 2014, he then delivered an important address focusing on the overriding goal of peaceful development and national renewal with the aim of turning China into a modern socialist country, prosperous and strong. So from the bicycle traffic of this, Beijing in the 1980s, to this in just 30 years. So what is the Belt and Road? To Western ears and eyes, the title, One Belt, One Road, is somewhat confusing. We all know what a road is, and most of us have heard of the ancient Silk Road that brought spices and other goods from China through Asia to Europe in medieval times. We presume, therefore, that the road describes a new Silk Road, consisting of perhaps rail and road routes crossing Central Asia and linking China with Europe. But if that is the case, where does the belt come in? To the Chinese, however, the meanings of the terms are rather different. A road is simply a transport route from its starting point to its destination. Nothing can generally be done along the route except travel. For example, a sea route. A belt, however, is much more than a transport route. You can hang things on a belt. It's an economic corridor. So in his book, Belt and Road, A Chinese World Order, by Bruno Marques, who was a long-time resident in China and formerly Portugal's minister to Europe, he describes it like this. You can all read it, so I'm not reading it out to you. But you see, it spans logistics, energy, manufacturing, agriculture, and tourism, culminating in the birth of a large Eurasian common market. Thus, belt is used to describe the land corridors envisaged in the Chinese initiative, while road refers to the sea routes for shipping. Now, once launched, there was furious activity in China. Books were written, think tanks created, meetings and conferences took place, exhibitions were arranged. How to implement the concept? What kind of projects would there be? How would they be financed? How would the projects be approved? How would they be implemented? Where, when, and with whom? And firmly under control, central control by the party, entrepreneurship was encouraged. But this time, primarily in the form of state capitalism, not private sector capitalism. In March 2015, a paper was released that set out the guiding principles, main projects and areas of cooperation. And in May 2015, Chinese media reported that there were over 900 projects already in the pipeline. In October 2017, the Belt and Road was formally included in the Chinese Communist Party's constitution, thereby cementing its place as a keystone of Chinese policy. So instead of the Western practice whereby private companies develop their own plans, raise their own finance, operate under corporate boards, produce profits for shareholders, and conduct their business largely independent of governments, the Belt and Road concept embraces coordination of projects by government in accordance with an overall plan. So, what is being achieved to date? Here is a map showing the economic corridors of the Belt and the maritime shipping routes of the road in the Eastern Hemisphere. Let us just linger a little on this map. You see how complicated it is. In the blue is the road, the maritime road, going around Southeast Asia, as far as New Zealand in the southeast side, and Africa, up through the Suez Canal into Europe, and right across the northern top of Russia. The economic belt runs from China through the center of Kazakhstan and on into eastern part of and Central Europe. And all the spots, all that you see on this map, are either existing infrastructure or planned infrastructure of the Belt and Road. And this, I might say, is only in the Eastern Hemisphere. We'll come along to Latin America and the Caribbean later in the talk. So in all the places shown on this map and beyond, China has projects, some still at the planning stage, some partially constructed, some completed. China has an estimated $68 billion worth of infrastructure projects planned for the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which you can see in the center of the screen. This runs from Kashgar in China through Pakistan-administered Kashmir to the port of Gwadar, and more about the port of Gwadar in a few minutes. According, this is how the Belt and Road was described by the Council on Foreign Relations earlier this year. More than 60 countries have signed on to projects, and China has already spent an estimated $200 billion on such efforts. And there again, you got the mention of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. China's projects cover a wide number of sectors, but first and foremost are oil and gas. Here are the priorities, oil and gas at the top, but you can see how many other areas there are: financial services, technology, consumer products, mining, life science, agriculture. And here is how Chinese investments and construction contracts have grown in the past 15 years up to mid-2019, but particularly in the past 5 years from 2014. You see how much they've risen there. In 2016, 2017, and you'll find, for reasons that I'll explain later, that they've tailed off a little since then. According to the New York Times, to date, China has helped us to finance at least 35 ports around the world. And here is a slide with some of them. All those dots are ports that China has helped to finance. And here are some examples of the construction projects. And the next one. And the next one. And here we have the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is a key development of the Belt and Road. At its southern end is the port of Gwadar. And Gwadar is located, as you can see, close to the Iranian border, no more than about 75 miles from the Iranian border, and it provides port facilities for the almost 8,000-mile shipping route between West Asia and China through the Malacca Strait. The China Overseas Port Holding Company is expanding the port, constructing nine multi-purpose berths along some 2 miles of seafront. At the southern tip of Sri Lanka lies the fishing village of Hambantota. Whenever Sri Lanka's president turned to his Chinese friends for loans and assistance to develop an ambitious port project, the answer was always yes. The China Harbour Engineering Company provided the expertise and skilled labor, and Chinese loans were made to Sri Lanka for the costs. But the Sri Lankan government struggled to make payments on the debt. Eventually, under heavy pressure and months of negotiation, in December 2018, the government handed over to China the whole port and 15,000 acres of land leased for around 99 years. Control of this port, as with other ports, would also provide berths and facilities for the Chinese Navy, if and when needed. Here is Myanmar and the port of Kyaukphyu. Connecting the port to China, China is building oil and gas pipelines together with a railway and a good highway. There are, of course, ports all around the world where improvements are constantly being made. But as far as I'm aware, only China has a specific government-sponsored international plan, such as Belt and Road. China has a plan. The West has no plan. In Djibouti, situated on the Horn of Africa at the southern end of the Red Sea, China has co-funded 4 new ports and linked them with the new 500-mile railway to Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. At this crucial maritime choke point, some 10% of global oil exports and 20% of global commercial goods are shipped through the narrow corridor, the narrow strait on their way to and from the Suez Canal. And in addition to port development, China has established an internet hub that handles all of Yemen's internet and that of Ethiopia and northern Somaliland. It has been reported that Beijing now holds over 70% of Djibouti's GDP in debt. And as if this wasn't enough, in Djibouti, China has now established its first overseas military base. This was established in 2017. And here is the geographical layout. Now you can see where Djibouti is compared with Yemen and the Red Sea and Saudi Arabia. And at the bottom, you can see a close-up of Djibouti with the Chinese multi-purpose port and the Chinese military base up to the top left. And down towards the bottom right, there is the airstrip, the international airport, where there are 4,000 US troops based there. Here is the port of Bagamoyo in Tanzania. In April 2019, China invited neighboring Zimbabwe for talks on how the latter could benefit from the Belt and Road Initiative. These 2 countries have now signed more than a dozen landmark projects, and it has been reported that Zimbabwe has so far tapped an estimated $3 billion from the $60 billion that China is making available for African countries. The Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, now hosts an annual forum on China-Africa cooperation, and that forum is attended by nearly all Africa's 54 heads of state and government. Now, the United States has also a much smaller, primarily private sector program to encourage development in Africa, but it is indeed much smaller. It's called Prosper Africa. And at its launch in Mozambique in 2019, the United States government didn't even send a cabinet secretary. The Belt and Road also extends to Latin America. Here's a map of China's projects in South America and the Caribbean. And don't be misled by the title American partners. these are actually China's partners in Latin America and the Caribbean, not partners of the USA. In December 2018, Ecuador signed a memorandum of understanding with China, joining the Belt and Road Initiative and making Ecuador the 16th nation from Latin America and the Caribbean area to do so. Ecuador already has a hydroelectric power station built by China and a copper mining operation financed by a Chinese consortium. And Ecuador and China have ratified a further 9 cooperative agreements related to assistance in criminal matters, police, agriculture, civil aviation, and risk management of volcanoes and earthquakes. China is also working with both hardware and software connectivity in the construction of what it calls the digital Silk Road. In April 2019, 15 enterprises from 8 countries signed 8 new cooperation projects. The Pakistan East Africa submarine optic cable connects Pakistan with Kenya via Djibouti, and China aims to connect it with Europe via a terrestrial cable system, building a new digital economic highway for Africa, Europe, and Central Asia. In May 2019, it was announced that a French shipping operator had ordered 10 container megaships from the China State Shipbuilding Corporation at a cost of 1.2 billion euros. And the big advantage of building the ships in China rather than in South Korea was that the deals included rights to operate piers and berths at the large network of ports being built and operated by Chinese companies as a result of the Belt and Road. And again, from the book I mentioned earlier by Bruno Mackay's, quote, control over a port means power over which ships get priority and allocation of berths and port services. And in times of conflict, this could also include the power to block ships, unquote. So much for the road. Let's look at the belt. China regards Kazakhstan as its gateway to Europe. It shares a border with the furthest west Chinese province, and at Korgos, just 25 miles east of Almaty, the Kazakh capital, in 2013, construction began on a 6 square kilometer, that's 2.5 square miles, site on what is known as a dry port for the transshipment of Chinese goods flowing to Europe by rail. Known as the Korgos Eastern Gates Special Economic Zone, the depot has giant cranes hoisting containers from Chinese trains to Kazakh rail cars because the rail gauge is different. And then they go onward shipping along a railway that stretches over 5,000 miles to Europe. Here is the depot in Korgos, and here is the unloading stage in one of the ports in Germany. Cargo can be moved from China's eastern coast to Europe in 15 days, which is far faster than going by sea and far cheaper than traveling by air. As you can see, this is a view to the London train, 44 containers, first freight on 3rd of January. By train, it took 18 days. By ship, it would have taken 40 days. And return from London to VU, 88 containers, which took 20 days. And by ship, it would have taken 40 days. Germany is China's largest European trading partner. There are 5 railway projects under the Belt and Road Initiative already linking German cities with Chinese centers. Incidentally, since 2008, China has developed the world's largest high-speed rail network. Here is the difference between 2008 and 10 years later. China reportedly has 18,000 miles today of high-speed rail and growing to 24,000 miles by 2025. On this chart on the right-hand side, the blue lines indicate high speed above 300 kilometers an hour. That's about 240 miles per hour. And here is Chongqing high-speed rail station. Does that look like any rail station you've seen in the United States? Europe has some 12,000 miles of high-speed rail, The United States doesn't have a single mile. Now, the states of Central Asia are of great importance to the success of the Belt and Road. Uzbekistan has large gold and uranium deposits, as well as considerable oil and gas reserves. The China National Petroleum Corporation has been working with Uzbekistan's national oil and gas company to develop the oil fields. And China also has 3 gas pipelines with Turkmenistan. Notwithstanding current international sanctions, Iran has much geostrategic value as a key hub in China's westward overland thrust. China and Persia had ties going back as far as the Han and Parthian empires. And in modern times, China needs oil. And although it has reduced its oil imports in order to preserve oil imports from Iran, in order to preserve the waivers of US sanction that it enjoys, it does see the benefits of encouraging greater regional stability and integration by locking China's Western neighbors into a zone of prosperity extending from China to Turkey and on to Europe. In July of this year, just 2 months ago, it was announced that China, as part of Belt and Road, would invest a total of $400 billion in Iran in banking, transport, ports, and development sectors in exchange for heavily discounted Iranian oil over the next 25 years. And according to the magazine Petroleum Economist and related Iranian reports, the central pillar of the New Deal is that China will invest $280 billion developing Iran's oil, gas, and petrochemical sectors. With an eye to exports through the Belt and Road, as well as its own domestic market, in 2015, China launched, quote, Made in China 2025. This is an industrial policy aimed at making China globally dominant in high-tech manufacturing. And as Peter said in his talk last week, China is expending a great effort on R&D, and the US advantage in R&D is rapidly disappearing. We've all heard about 5G technology, the success of the Chinese firm Huawei, and how it has increased its market share. According to a Heritage Foundation report of May 2020, Beijing may have better electronic surveillance access to Africa than any other country, as it has built or renovated at least 186 government buildings and installed at least 14 intragovernmental telecommunication networks. And here is a map of countries in Africa where China has constructed government buildings. Xi Jinping has pledged an estimated $1.4 trillion through 2025 for technologies ranging from wireless networks to artificial intelligence. By a focus on 10 high-tech industries, such as electric cars, new energy vehicles, next-generation information technology, advanced robotics, and artificial intelligence, the aim is to overtake present American and Western superiority. By promoting Chinese high-tech manufacturers in the global marketplace, in time, China plans on replacing Western standards with Chinese standards. And you heard more about the significance of this standards replacement in Peter's talk last week. China aims to achieve 70% self-sufficiency in high-tech industries by 2025 and complete dominance in global markets by 2049. So then, what have then been the reactions to China's Belt and Road? China's Belt and Road projects are not without some significant challenges. Loans have gone mainly to high-risk countries. While the Chinese initiative has been warmly received in many quarters, particularly in countries lacking their own financial and other resources, high regard has not been completely universal. In some instances, projects that were at first warmly received engendered local criticism, when it was found that much of the labor was not going to be local labor, but would be Chinese labor. And the finance generously provided by China, usually in the form of soft loans rather than grants, was often going back to China through the payment of labor costs and materials. Several instances have sullied the initiative's brand. In some areas, farmers have objected to giving up rural land in order for rail construction. And then loading up developing countries with unpayable debts and then relieving the debts by transfer of assets for a period of 99 years or lease has caused resentment. The $68 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor has been scaled back amid Pakistan's increasing debt problems, while the major port for Kiokpyu in Myanmar was slimmed down from roughly $7 billion to $1.3 billion. Elsewhere, projects have been tarnished by corruption. The Malaysian government renegotiated a major rail project at a significantly reduced cost and cancelled $3 billion worth of plans to build new pipelines following a graft scandal. Several countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, have expressed serious misgivings about the extent to which they could lose national control over their facilities, which have been developed by Chinese under Belt and Road. An outcome of all these complaints and the incidence of corruption has caused the Chinese government to step back somewhat from the heady days of earlier years of Belt and Road. According to the China Global Investment Tracker, published by the American Enterprise Institute, the total worldwide Chinese investments and construction in 2019 was estimated to be $124 billion, half of what it was in 2016. Nevertheless, $124 billion is a great deal of money. In fact, China is stepping back for a short period, but it is not going to step away because the policy is cemented into the Chinese Communist Constitution. European reaction has also been cautious, particularly since the onset of COVID-19, but not entirely negative. In UK, China has a 33.5% interest in the construction of the new nuclear power plant at Hinkley in southwestern England. And it's going to be interesting to see if China continues this investment now that the British government has announced its withdrawal from Huawei's 5G infrastructure in UK. For the most part, Europeans seem unsure how to handle the Belt and Road Initiative. It is in the interests of both China and the EU to have strong trade links, and perhaps even more so in the light of recent attitudes to the EU taken by the Trump administration. At the same time, China's focus on the 16 countries of Eastern and Central Europe as a full part of the Belt and Road Initiative has been perceived in Berlin and Paris, and therefore in the EU center of Brussels, as potentially unsettling. However, as may be seen from this slide, the Belt and Road Initiative is worldwide in concept, with the significant exception perhaps of North America, that's the United States and Canada, Australia and Japan. As yet, and probably never, China doesn't appear to see any benefit in trying to move Belt and Road into USA and Canada. And indeed, any such effort might easily exacerbate the already prickly relations between the two largest economies in the world. But this slide shows clearly how the share of trade between the United States and several traditional friends has gone down, while the share of trade between them and China has gone up. And let me try to explain this. The share of trade in 2000, you see Philippines and Japan, share of trade with the United States was roughly 25%. But by 2008, you see Japan had fallen to 15%, Philippines had fallen to 10%. And so all the others, because down the bottom line, the horizontal axis share of trade with China, 10, 20, 30%, and the vertical axis share of trade with the United States. You see, in all those countries, trade has dropped from trade with the United States down to much more trade with China. So what then are the political and strategic implications? Some commentators have played down the Belt and Road Initiative as little more than a Chinese branding image. Others take the view that all China is seeking is a series of favorable trading arrangements in Southeast Asia. But as I think I've shown, it's much, much wider than that. Secretary of State Pompeo, speaking in London on the 15th of May 2019, was stinging in his comments. He roundly criticized China for peddling, quote, corrupt infrastructure deals in exchange for political influence, unquote. And also he said, quote, using bribe-fueled debt trap diplomacy, unquote. And the acerbic level of this exchange between the foreign ministers of the United States and China has continued since then. It's just one indication of worsening relations, and it does not bode well for the future. But how about India? China has long had friction with India. India has regarded Belt and Road, particularly with its projects in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, as an effort by China to surround India and to extend China's influence in the Indian Ocean. India views the China-Pakistan economic corridor as a major threat to its national security. And this perhaps might have been a factor in India's cancellation of the autonomy of India-administered Kashmir in August of last year. On one hand, India shares a border with China, and they both recognize they have to live with each other, but their relations are not good. Although India has not welcomed Belt and Road, neither has it spurned it entirely. The leaderships of both countries recognize that they are together responsible for 1/3 of the entire global population, and the socio-economic demands of their peoples have to be met, despite the differences in their political systems. As part of Belt and Road, China needs access to the markets and ports of Southeast Asia. For instance, China has projects in Cambodia to develop the port of Sihanoukville. It has a $6 billion project in Laos, drilling hundreds of tunnels and bridges to support a 260-mile railway that will eventually connect 8 Asian countries. And yet several countries in Southeast Asia are conscious that they're rather like mice living between two elephants. India, for its part, can see some benefits from partnering with China in selected projects, but continues to be concerned by perceptions of being surrounded. As mentioned earlier, in Europe, there are mixed feelings. The EU is already facing internal turmoil with Brexit and with populist movements in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere. And in September 2017, German Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel emphasized the importance of Europe sticking together. And he said this: "And yet, as European ties with the United States have become increasingly strained since 2017, so indeed must the EU look elsewhere, reassess its own attitude to Belt and Road and its role in the global order." So then, why should America care about all this? This massive worldwide Belt and Road initiative, together with the implications of other aspects of Chinese expansion, give rise, I believe, to some serious questions for the United States and the West. In November 2011, Secretary of State Clinton authored an article in Foreign Policy entitled America's Pacific Century. And shortly after that, the Obama administration announced pivot to Asia. That was 2011, as a rebalancing of United States political and military attention. Prime Minister Rudd of Australia, Prime Minister at the time, welcomed this pivot, saying, quote, "Without such a move, there's a danger that China, with its hardline, realist view of international relations, would conclude that an economically exhausted United States was losing its staying power in the Pacific." As the second decade of the 21st century unfolded in tandem with the emergence of Belt and Road, it became clear in Washington the United States' interests would be better served by widening political, economic, and military relations with more countries than those on the Pacific Rim. The United States took action to become a member of the East Asia Summit, assisted in the development of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and became a member of that trade agreement in February 2016. However, wide support from Congress was absent, and immediately after President Trump took office in January 2017, he signed a memorandum withdrawing the United States from the TPP. This has left China free to develop its own rival free trade agreement with other countries. By 2019, the breadth and depth of the Belt and Road Initiative could be seen more clearly. There must indeed be a high risk of China overreaching its lofty aims, but the fact remains that Belt and Road is almost worldwide. And what I've shown you today is only a sampling of One Belt, One Road. As I said right at the beginning, it is far, far larger than the Marshall Plan. The experience of coronavirus in 2020 is having a major impact. Several recipients of Chinese loans are having difficulty in repayments and are asking for reconsideration. And at home, China has its own difficulties in financing the projects. In March of this year, the World Bank lowered its estimate of China's annual growth for 2020 from 6.1% to 2.3%. And yet, China is now recovering economically, while we in the West are still floundering. And the Belt and Road Initiative will continue to be at the heart of China's foreign policy. Now, in the West, we've been proud of our liberal world order, and we have hoped that it would become the norm for the rest of the globe. But as Bruno Matthias said in the cover of his book, China has a different concept of world order, and it's energetically promoting it through One Belt, One Road, and through its more active diplomacy and its economic and military expansion. In his book, Bruno Matthias postulated 4 possible scenarios if Belt and Road is successful. Number 1, China is gradually integrated into the liberal world order, and despite differences in their political systems, the United States and China effectively rule the world economy together. Number 2, China achieves its aim of replacing the United States as the center of world power, but the Chinese political and economic model converges with Western practices, and so the liberal world order survives unscathed. Number 3, China takes over from the United States as the center of global power, with the result that the very structure and values of the world system are rethought and reconfigured. The liberal world order is replaced with a Chinese order. And 4, the 2 visions of the world order are forced to coexist, and China and the United States reach some kind of uneasy balance of integration together with conflict and rivalry. Now, inevitably, all these possibilities are speculative, and they're subject to setbacks and unforeseen events, such as we've seen in the coronavirus this year. And none of these options provide space for China and India to find either a workable accommodation or alternatively to engage in persistent friction and rivalry of their own. But that said, given that China has never accepted Western values of human rights, press freedom, individual liberty, and private sector capitalism, it would seem that the first 2 of these options can probably be discounted. By the mid-21st century, protected by its geographical position between 2 major oceans and still a major power, the United States may find itself dealing with the 4th option, and that will entail repeated challenges and confrontations, political, diplomatic, and military. China aims to change the architecture of the international system to one which embraces the Chinese Communist Party's principles for how nations should deal with each other. The clash of values, I believe, the clash of value systems between a Chinese world order and the Western liberal world order are stark. Autocracy versus democracy, collective responsibility versus individual human rights, government control of the media versus freedom of the press, tight control of public opinion versus freedom of expression. And as China's influence spreads throughout the world, more and more of those countries are going to recognize China's clout in these as to which order they should accept. And so it is the 3rd option that I believe presents the greatest challenge and threat to the liberal world order. Now, hopefully, it's a less likely outcome, but it does exist as a distinct possibility. 30 years ago, or even 20, very few would have forecast that by 2020, China would be the world's largest economy. Next year, 2021, will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And we're already less than 30 years from 2049, by when China envisages eclipsing the United States as the global superpower. The world is changing fast, and in my view, we should not be surprised if China achieves its aim rather earlier than 2049. So in my view, all these are reasons why America should care, particularly as the United States international cooperation and leadership have stumbled in recent years. The United States and its Western friends need to face up to China, its Belt and Road Initiative, its upsetting of world trade, its growing economic and military power, and its concept of world order. The West will have to decide just how much value we do attach to our own liberal world order, and we need to take steps to nurture it and keep it healthy. On the 23rd of July, just 6 weeks ago, at the Richard Nixon Memorial Library, Secretary of State Pompeo set out the Trump administration's policy towards China. He gave his speech the title Communist China and the Free World's Future. Instead of noting the serious differences and an intention to search for an approach by which both systems could be together, he was aggressive and belligerent. But to me, I would suggest this is not a Rome versus Carthage issue, where one has to be destroyed in order for the other to prosper. There is in fact room in the world for two or even more concepts, provided both are vigorous and healthy, and providing they engage each other in constructive and peaceful competition. But let's face it, at present, our Western concept of world order is disordered, fragmented, fractured, and at odds with itself. China has a plan, the West has no plan. So here are some of the questions that are facing us and will face generations of the future. Is the Western concept of a liberal world order, moderately regulated free market capitalism, a vibrant private sector, and comparatively limited government healthy enough to compete successfully with the Chinese concept of centralized government and state capitalism? Will the countries of the West, with their differences of political systems and cultures, work together to promote a multilateral global vision? Or will competing attitudes of nationalism, tribal identities, persistent income inequality, and social discord at home combine to undermine the concept of liberal world order that we have developed so successfully over the past 2 centuries? Will we in the West be so disordered that we get picked off one by China? And just as important, and here I am specifically addressing the United States, will there be competent, inspirational leadership and sound institutions that can command the trust and confidence of the citizens at home and allies and friends abroad? Now, of course, I understand that what is going on domestically with COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, street protests and the election, it really is rather difficult for people to think outwardly, abroad and far ahead. But in sum, will the United States maintain its position at the forefront of the liberal world order? Or will it turn inwards, lose its sense of direction, lose its friends and allies, and possibly even lose the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and find itself eclipsed by China by 2049, or perhaps several years earlier? This, in my view, is why Americans should really care about the Belt and Road and its implications for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Okay, we have some comments here. Steve Sinding, the Belt and Road Initiative has very different goals than the Marshall Plan, apples and oranges. We believe in private enterprise, not a government-sponsored plan for global economic dominance.
Well, yes, I agree with you, Steve, but therein lies the difference. China has a plan. As Peter said last week, and I agree with him, the West has no plan. And by leaving it all to private sector, then what happens is that they will take interest according to themselves as providing a coordinated plan. And so the danger is that we lose out. So therein lies the difference between us.
Bill Friedman asks, would the overwhelming emphasis of the Belt and Road on oil and gas rather than wind, solar, and non-fossil fuel energy prove a disadvantage over time or are they heavily invested in other sources as well?
Well, as far as I'm aware, I mean, they, like everybody else, recognize that eventually we're going to move away from the fossil fuel driven for energy to other things. But at the same time, again, as Peter said last week, and I repeated in this talk, China is going very much for advanced R&D in all kinds of higher technology, robotics, and other sources to explore the possibilities for energy. So the jury, I think, is still out. Whether, in fact, China will concentrate too much on oil and gas. At the moment, that's what it needs, oil and gas. But it is exploring all those other things, as I mentioned, mineral deposits in Turkmenistan, and as I understand it, China is also funding a copper industry in Afghanistan. I mean, there are lots of parts of this Belt and Road that I haven't been able to mention in 45 minutes, but it remains to be seen how far China will shift when it feels that it can from fossil fuel energy to other sources.
We have a question from Steve Sinding. North American and Europe together are far wealthier and more powerful militarily and economically than China. Isn't rebuilding the Atlantic Alliance our #1 priority for competing with China?
Well, that's absolutely so. I actually have another slide. I don't know whether you can show it, Gloria, of Pompeo's remarks at that talk that he gave on July 2030. Can you show that one, Gloria? So he said, "We can't face this challenge alone. The United Nations, NATO, the G7 countries, the G20, our combined economic, diplomatic, and military power is surely enough to meet this challenge if we direct it clearly and with great courage. Maybe it's a time for a new grouping of like-minded nations, a new alliance of democracies." Yeah, well, that's all very well. That's pretty rich. But unfortunately, what the United States has done in the last 2 or 3 years is offended the Europeans, criticized NATO, upset Chancellor Merkel in Germany, irritated South Korea, irritated Japan, left the TPP. So it's a fine time to be talking about a new group of like-minded nations when in fact you upset so many along the way. But I agree with you, Steve. I think somehow that the United States and Europe have actually got to take a measure of themselves and try to work together as a #1 priority for competing with China. I entirely agree.
And Bill Friedman asks, given that the success of China's plan will inevitably limit the reach, power, and profits of US capitalist enterprises, why are the Republicans seemingly so comfortable with Trump's withdrawal from the economic, trade, and other links they surely recognize will prove harmful to their own interests? Do they not recognize the threat, not think it is as serious as this talk makes it appear? Fear Trump more than the diminutions of US capitalism seems strangely counter to self-interest.
Yeah, well, Bill, I entirely agree with you. And this is where I come back to the question. I mean, frankly, there are some people who sort of say, look, why should the US lead, provide the leadership for the liberal world order? And the fact is that nobody else can do it. No other country has the clout and the resources and the size to be able to do it. By not recognizing that responsibility, then I think there's a risk of missing the vote, which brings me to the point that will there be competent, inspirational leadership and sound institutions that will command the support of American citizens and friends and allies abroad? And at the moment, I don't think that's on the cards.
Walter Miller says this: I doubt that the West can pull together until there is a crisis of some sort, something that will cause various countries to politically pull some response together. Agree?
Yes, I mean, it's quite often crises which cause things to happen, because otherwise, particularly in our Western world, as we know, politicians kick the can down the road. If they can, they survive until the next election, and sooner or later, the problem will be in somebody else's problem to look after. So perhaps there has to be some sort of crisis. Now, whether that crisis will be political or diplomatic or military, as I also said in my brief interjection in Peter's talk last week, I don't believe the US military or the Chinese military want to get into direct conflict. But the fact remains that there's always a chance of the untoward thing happening in the China Seas, over Taiwan, the Pacific Rim. And if something happens, then all of a sudden the media and the people demand action to be taken, and the military get pitchforked into something that they didn't really want to get involved in. That to me is the kind of crisis that might emerge.
Bruce McLaury asks, investment can be the engine of growth or a huge waste. Any assessment of what proportion of Chinese investment worldwide is one kind or the other?
Wow. Bruce, I think that's above my pay grade. If Peter is in on this, he might like to offer a comment. Peter?
Do you want me to respond to that, Derek?
Yes, please.
Oh, this is a hard one. You shouldn't do that to me. Yeah. There's no question. A lot of this investment is going to be wasted. But the politics is, I think this is more about the politics than it is about the economics. This is an attempt by the Chinese to buy a great deal of influence, and if there are very significant losses along the way, I think they can sustain those losses. A lot of this investment doesn't appear to be sort of have an immediate payoff. I think they're taking an incredibly long view of these investments. And so, yeah, there's going to be a lot of waste, but the political payoff may outweigh the economic loss. I think that's the way we should look at it. And I just want to pick up on what Derek's been saying. The West has no plan. The West doesn't even think about having a plan. I mean, this is one of the themes coming across a lot of these questions. I'm not even sure how the West can put together a plan since it relies on private enterprise so much. And that's it's a very interesting. It's almost a contradiction. So anyway, enough of me. I hope that helped.
Okay, Nancy Morris asks, what about a mass revolt from the countries that have accepted loans from China with no economic advantage to their countries?
Well, I think there is economic advantage to many of the countries to have improved roads, improved ports, improved railway lines, things that they couldn't afford for themselves. They don't like, sometimes, as I've explained and described, the Chinese labor doing the work instead of local labor. They certainly don't like to have heavy debt loaded on them, although China is very much tried to make this debt soft loans rather than hard loans. But I don't see such a thing as a mass revolt happening, because in revolting, what would they do? They would be biting the hand that might possibly feed them, and there was no other hand that's likely to feed them. So I just don't see that kind of thing happening.
Nancy also asks, any chance of a Tiananmen Square uprising?
No. To me, what happened in Hong Kong, in many respects, with the new security law, was brought on by the violence that the young people in Hong Kong showed themselves. In other words, did they not realize what China did in Tiananmen Square in 1989? Didn't they realize that if they continue breaking up many of the installations and blocking the airport and blocking the railway and blocking the shopping thing, that sooner or later China was going to take action? In my view, I've always felt that China's relationship when the British moved out of Hong Kong and to have one country with two systems was always trying to send a message to Taiwan that, look, we can make this work with Hong Kong. Why can't we make it work with you? Well, eventually, China had to move in and put the muscle into Hong Kong. Taiwan has obviously taken the message, but the fact is that the Chinese Communist Party quite clearly is not going to entertain any possibility of another rising like Tiananmen Square. It will put it down with great ferocity if it happens.
What do you, Steve Sending asks, what do you see as the top priority for a Biden administration?
Well, I'd like to think that when a Biden administration, of course, has huge domestic problems to come to grips with. And that will consume a lot of political air in their concerns. But I would like to think that they will have the advisors to reconstruct the soundness of institutions, the intelligence community, the State Department, many of the other institutions that have been kind of undermined in the past 2 or 3 years, and would also, somewhere along the line, and I don't quite know where it's going to come from, I would like to hear it from Biden and Kamala Harris, but competent, inspirational leadership. I would like to see that happen. Whether it will, of course, is a whole different matter.
Let's see, we have a question from Gail Ebling. What internal Chinese political movements could derail this plan?
I think there's been a big, I mean, China having set all these state capitalist projects going and all the banking loans has opened up the great possibilities for corruption, for graft, and for things like that. And Xi Jinping, in his efforts to try to stamp this out, has been very firm on trying to deal with Chinese corruption. But the Chinese, by nature, by the human nature of the individuals, they're all gamblers. And when there is so much money sloshing around, there is a great deal of chance that corruption will continue. But whether that leads to a political movement, my impression is that the Chinese Communist Party has no intention whatsoever of allowing allowing there to be a political movement to derail it. I'm just going to read you something which is from the Chinese Communist Party's constitution. And as we all know, when things get locked into constitutions, they're difficult to shake. Here's a quote, the English language version. The basic line of the Communist Party of China in the primary stage of socialism is to lead the people of China together in a self-reliant and pioneering effort, making economic development the central task, upholding the 4 cardinal principles, and remaining committed to reform and the opening up so as to see China becomes a great modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. Now, you can disagree with that as much as you like, but it is part and parcel of the Chinese constitution. And I don't see that the Chinese Communist Party has any, going to provide any possible opening for a derailing by any other political movement.
This may be a similar question. Lee Allen says, will China be able to maintain its command and control political system internally?
Well, again, as I said, China has always been accustomed to centralized government from the center. And people, because they don't have the concept of the freedom of the individual. I remember when I was at the UN, I once talked with a Chinese delegate, a Chinese member from the Chinese mission. And he said to me, you know, you people in the West don't realize and that when you have a country of 1.3 billion, community rights trump individual rights each and every time. Looking after the community at the expense of any individual rights has to be part and parcel of the policy. And that is so. So I think it will be able to maintain its command and control of the political system internally.
Okay, Kathy Fisher, thanks you for connecting the dots so well in this presentation. Her question, years ago, I read that some African countries had a significant backlash against Chinese investments due to the way the Chinese project supervisors treated African labor. The broad question is whether China is learning from its mistakes. It is in their interest to make themselves a preferred partner. And if they learn to adapt to local norms, they will become an even more formidable competitor. Same question applies to imposing unsustainable debt burdens of Belt and Road participants. How much is China learning that a softer approach will be more successful for them going forward?
Well, I think that's the $64,000 or yuan question. How much are they learning from it? I have also read articles that Africans in Beijing often feel themselves being denigrated by many of the Chinese. They're just the wrong skin color. So one would hope that China is learning from its lessons. European colonialists in Africa never did learn their lessons, whether they were British or Belgian or French or Italian. And so I think this is a lesson that, as you say, China is going to have to try to learn. Whether they will learn it remains to be seen.
John McInerney has a comment. Anyone seriously interested in this topic should read Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy by Kishore Mahbubani. It is outstanding. It is very strategic and discusses much of what the US is doing wrong.
Yeah, thank you, John. You and I have discussed this before. I met Kishore Mahbubani when he was the Singaporean ambassador to the United Nations when I was working there. I have a great respect for Kishore Mahbubani. And I have said this to some of our other friends, and we have a wider audience tonight. When you're dealing with most people in Southeast Asia, they feel that they lose face by saying no to you. They will hesitate and fritter about until a Westerner who wants a clear answer, up, down, black, white, yes, no, until the Westerner arrives at the conclusion that what his answer is going to get is no. Singaporeans are different. Singaporeans are very direct, and Kishore Mahbubani is an example of that directness. He went from being in the Singapore ambassador to the UN. He went back, he became dean, I think, of the Singapore University, and he continues to write these comments today. I would encourage people to do a search for him on a Google search on YouTube and see some of the things he's written. I agree with you. One other thing, while we're talking about it, there's another book. I mentioned two books. Here's another book. I don't know whether it comes in, which is The New Silk Roads, The Present and Future of the World by Peter Frankopan. That's another book that is well worth reading, along with the other two that I mentioned in my talk.
There doesn't appear to be any more questions or comments, so I think we can end here. I'd like to thank you, Derek, for, again, another well-researched and well-presented presentation. Thank you all for joining us this evening. As a matter of fact, Derek and I are already talking about 2021 and what he can do for us next year. And again, thank you to the Keelan Family Foundation for their support. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye now. Thank you.